evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 9th annual presentation of the Goldsmith Awards. These awards are named for Berta Goldsmith, who lived her entire life in Philadelphia until she died there 11 years ago at the age of 97. She was a former concert pianist and medical technician, and she left most of her fortune to those charities. But journalism was another area of special interest for her. Mrs. Goldsmith believed strongly in the critical role that the press plays in democratic society. She was a faithful follower of Washington Week of Review, Wall Street Week, and 60 Minutes, and visitors to her home were expected to be fully informed on those projects, those programs, and the topics they examined. Like other awards and endowed lectures here at the Kennedy School, the Goldsmith Awards acknowledge excellence, in this case, excellence in investigative reporting and in research about government, politics, and the press. And they reflect our tradition of bringing together practitioners and scholars. They're administered through the Kennedy School's Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy, which is dedicated to examining the intersection of theory and practice in those fields. We're very honored to have Walter Shorenstein with us this evening. It was for his daughter, Joan, who worked as a producer at CBS, that the center is named. Walter, thank you for your foresight in creating this institution. To introduce our program this evening and the special privilege we have of honoring a close friend, I would like to turn to Tom Patterson, who's the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press and the acting director of the Shorenstein Center. Tom has forged a career as one of America's foremost analysts of public opinion, politics, and journalism. His book, The Unseeing Eye, was named by the American Association for Public Opinion Research as one of the 50 most influential books on public opinion in the past half century. He's written many other highly regarded volumes, as well as numerous articles in major academic journals in the popular press. And now, to present to you Bill Covetch, our honoree of the evening, I introduce to you the acting director of the Shorenstein Center, indeed a brilliant acting director, Tom Patterson. Tom?
Thank you, Joe. That was very kind. We will introduce Bill Covetch. It'll be a little later in the evening, and we've got a very nice program, I think, that will precede that. This is the 9th time that the Goldsmith Awards have been given to young scholars, writers, and journalists. And the awards were made possible through the imaginative efforts of Robert Greenfield. Bob is a Philadelphia lawyer, now retired, a graduate of the Harvard Law School, and he looked after the legal and financial affairs of Berta Goldsmith, also of Philadelphia. And shortly after she died in 1989, Mr. Greenfield met Professor Gary Orrin of our faculty, and the two of them, walking and talking on a beach in Florida, Gary lives well, conceived the awards program that bears her name. Bob Greenfield was scheduled to be with us tonight, but his flight was canceled, and nevertheless I wanted to acknowledge his important role in this process. Joe's already recognized Walter and our great debt to Walter, and I would also like to recognize Marvin Kelb, who helped put this program together and for 8 years presided over the Goldsmith Award ceremony. The awards come in 4 categories. First are the research awards, most of which are given to young scholars. Second is the $5,000 Goldsmith Book Award, given to the book which, in our judgment, best explores the intersection of press, politics, and public policy. Then we have the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, a $25,000 award to the news report that, in our judgment, is the best of the year in the field of investigative reporting. And finally, the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism, given each year to a journalist who throughout his or her career has personified the profession's highest standards. And we're going to start with the Goldsmith Research Awards, and I've asked Pippa Norris, Associate Director for Research at the Shorenstein Center, to present them. Pippa?
Every year, it's always a great pleasure to present these awards, which, as Tom has said, are very much for the younger scholars to help them in their research, for scholarship as they're working in the early stages of their career. You know, as I was thinking about this, there are many things that are there for good research, many things which you need. One clearly is big ideas, important ideas, ideas which address political problems, problems of the press, and which are not just in academe, but really reach out and tackle some of the major issues of the age. Another thing which is very important, which Fred always mentioned, is essentially time, peace and quiet, an office where you can work, time for reflection, time for thought, what Virginia Woolf used to call a room of one's own. But of course, the third thing, the mother's milk of American politics, and of course, the essential thing for any research is some money, some resources, some support, in order to get the time and in order to get the big ideas. So what I'd like to do is just say a line or two about each of the people who are being given awards tonight, just to tell you a little bit about what they're working on and what this basic program supports. They're all listed in the program, and I'll just say a word or two about each. Rosalind Barnett at Brandeis University and Carol Rivers at Boston University. How the media distort research findings. A study about how ineffective coverage in the press, especially coverage of science, gives people the wrong ideas about public policy and flawed public policy solutions. Peter Enge, freelance reporter, on a very important issue, the media and political change in Southeast Asia, looking at how journalists are covering the major transformations going on in Indonesia and in Malaysia. David Niven, Florida University, and Jeremy Zilber, College of William and Mary, who's working on how the news media is biased in a liberal direction, what's the extent of that, and what are the ways in which press coverage could be promoted in a fair direction. Evelyn Seaman at Purdue University, The Black Media, a Communication Ghetto, how black media outlets are essentially able to target very effectively the interests of African American viewers and cater to the needs of those communities. Lynn Vavrick, Dartmouth College. Do attack ads help or hinder voters? A major issue which is clearly being debated in terms of the negative coverage that we've seen in the campaign. And she's looking at the effects on voter turnout, on participation and learning across the states, focusing on the 1998 races. Brian White, University of Illinois, Chicago, who's looking at mediating education reform. In particular, a case study of how the Chicago press has covered the debates about education reform in that area. Mark Wolfgram, University of Wisconsin-Madison, visualizing the imagined community. A very interesting project about history, memory, and politics in Germany, and in particular, how the mediums of television and newspapers frame our understanding of German national history since the war. And lastly, Julian Zalga, SUNY Albany, Making Democracy Work, Congressional Reform, and a book which will be produced from that, including the first comprehensive history of congressional reform in recent years, and the role of the news media in how it covered that. So all very worthy grants, and I'm very successful, I'm sure, in their research. We wish them all well, and I'd like to say that we hope that their endeavors are very successful, and the resources from this give them the time for the big ideas and the reflection that really lead to excellent research. So congratulations to everybody.
Thank you, Pippa. Well, it's my pleasure to present the next award, the Goldsmith Book Prize, given each year, as I indicated earlier, to the, what we believe at least, is the top book in the press politics field. The prize carries a $5,000 cash award. And each year, the awards committee's task gets more and more difficult. The media are a hot topic. The list of published books gets longer, and our selection process gets tougher. But this year's recipient is Robert McChesney of the University of Illinois, his book, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, is a tour de force of the great policy issues that face us, from media mergers to the internet. As the title suggests, Rich Media, Poor Democracy takes a relatively dim view of most of what is happening in the media. Bob McChesney had planned to be here with us tonight, but his plane was struck with lightning and forced to land in Detroit, and he couldn't get another flight in time. You know, I think those who control the airwaves were maybe trying to send Bob a message about his books. Well, we go now to the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting. As many of you know, investigative journalism has its roots in the progressive era. There was muckraking journalism in an earlier period, but it was deeply partisan. Andrew Jackson was hammered by the Whig papers, but he could take comfort in the Democratic ones. The progressive movement more or less brought the era of partisan press to a close, and today's politicians have no safe haven in the press. Ask Bill Clinton. The term investigative reporting is newer in origin, at least in terms of everyday language. Watergate popularized it and made it a larger part of American journalism, to both the benefit and detriment of our politics. At its best, as we will see tonight, investigative reporting shines a light on activities that should be brought into the open, and it does so in a fair and accurate way. The Washington Post set the standard. It was nearly 50 stories deep into its Watergate coverage before any of its reports contained a major factual error, testimony to Ben Bradley's insistence on the integrity of the news process. Investigative reporting doesn't always work that well. As Bill Covetch and Tom Rosenstiel document in their recent book, Warp Speed, the initial reporting of the Lewinsky scandal was fueled by rumor, unnamed sources, and not surprisingly, was often wrong in its facts. But tonight, we celebrate investigative journalism at its best. It was gratifying to sit on the committee that read and reviewed the many news reports that were nominated for this prize. Clearly, there are many journalists and news organizations determined to engage in tough but accurate and fair-minded investigative journalism. We found it extremely difficult to select the winner of this $25,000 prize. The truth is, when you read all of these submissions, you can rather quickly narrow the field to a couple of dozen, but after that, it gets very difficult. The 6 finalists for this year's Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting are in alphabetical order, and when I call your news organization and then your name, please stand in place. The Associated Press, reporters Sang-Hun Cho, Charles Hanley, Martha Mendoza, and Randy Hersheft for their series entitled The Bridge at No Gun Ri, investigating allegations that American troops killed hundreds of refugees early in the Korean War. The day after the story broke, President Clinton ordered a thorough investigation of the incident. The Boston Globe, reporters Robert Whitaker and Dolores Kong for their series entitled Doing Harm, Research on the Mentally Ill. They found that researchers for 25 years have abused mentally ill patients by withholding helpful drugs or deliberately inducing symptoms. As a result of this reporting, the National Institute of Mental Health suspended studies seeking to induce psychosis in mentally ill students or patients, and is reviewing its funding of such research. Thank you. The Chicago Tribune, reporters Ken Armstrong and Maurice Posley for the series Trial and Error, which documented nearly 400 cases of serious misconduct nationwide by prosecutors in obtaining convictions in homicide cases. In response, the Illinois legislature formed an investigative committee to examine reforms. The Los Angeles Times, Washington Bureau, reporter David Willman for his series Resolin, a billion-dollar killer, which revealed how the FDA's fast-track approval of a miracle drug for diabetics enriched the company but poisoned the patients. The FDA has since re-examined Resolin's safety and concluded the drug caused hundreds of cases of acute liver failure. Time Magazine, reporters Donald L. Bartlett and James B. Steele, for their series entitled What Corporate Welfare Costs. Their eighth-month investigation revealed that while welfare for individuals has been cut, corporate welfare is rampant and based on relatively spurious arguments about the benefits to society of corporate subsidies and tax breaks. And finally, the Toledo Blade, reporter Sam Rowe, for his series entitled Deadly Alliance, How Government and Industry Chose Weapons Over Workers, which exposed how the U.S. defense establishment put workers' lives in danger in the production of the metal beryllium for use in nuclear weapons. The series brought about major safety reforms and prompted 2 congressional investigations. All 6 finalists, excellent reporters and news organizations, deserve this prize. They all wrote important and powerful pieces. The committee agonized, but we did select a winner. And the winner is Time Magazine, Donald Bartlett and James Steele, What Corporate Welfare Costs. Please come forward and accept the prize. And we do have a prize to be.
This really is almost a little embarrassing because the competition, as Tom said, was just extraordinary in this. And when you're a writer in a certain area, you don't see what's going on in other parts of the country. And I haven't seen all of these stories, but I have seen David Willman's stories on Resolin, and they are just unbelievable. And so it's embarrassing, basically. This is nice.
I think the most important thing I want to tell you is I'm glad I wasn't a judge at this contest either. And I think that's what happens with good journalism. There's so much good stuff that funnels into the end. I think my only regret is I never knew Mrs. Goldsmith. Being a Philadelphian, obviously living not that far away from where she was all those years, this is the kind of person I think we could have had many good conversations. And I just want to thank the judges, thank the committee, thank the Kennedy School, and this is a deep honor, which is very humbling. Thank you so much.
I would now like to invite the other finalists to come up and receive a token of our esteem for their work. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Now, with a great deal of personal pleasure, it's time for me to introduce the recipient of the 2000 Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism, Bill Covetch. We've asked a few of Bill's many colleagues and friends over the years to help us put his career in perspective. One of Bill's oldest friends, David Halberstam, had this to say: "We've been friends for 40 years, and he's the best. The most passionate and tough-minded and yet ethical journalist and editor of our generation. Bill is what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they gave us these great freedoms." Covetch's 40-year friendship with Halberstam began when Bill was working at the Nashville Tennessean, covering Southern politics and particularly the expanding civil rights movement. His work carried him in 1968 to the New York Times, where he worked for 18 years, the last 8 as the Times' Washington bureau chief. Among his colleagues was Bill Keller, now managing editor of the Times. He says of Covetch, "Bill was such a good Washington bureau chief that the entire cast of 40 egomaniacs, malcontents, idiot savants, show horses and grinds, novices and burnout cases employed in the Times bureau worked at about 120% of their ability because they wanted to make him proud. He was smart without feeling the need to rub it in your face, skeptical without being cynical, demanding without being overbearing, and he had that indispensable editor's gift, the ability to get really enthusiastic about a reporter's story without trying to take it over. I don't think I've worked for an editor who commanded the loyalty we felt for Bill. I worked there during the 2 years before Abe Rosenthal's retirement, and I don't think there was a reporter in the Bureau who wasn't rooting for Bill to win the succession struggle and become executive editor. Those who were better versed than I was in New York Times criminology, and that's as in Kremlin, not criminal, criminology, figured Bill had no chance because Abe Rosenthal thought that Bill was a communist. Since then, I've met some actual communists, and I'm pretty sure Bill isn't one. Bill Covetch left the Times to become editor of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. It had been 20 years since that newspaper had won a Pulitzer. In Bill's 2 years there, it won 2 Pulitzers. The second for a series by Bill Dedman and Sonny Rawls that documented Atlanta's insidious pattern of neighborhood segregation enforced by banks' mortgage practices. The problem is you can't shake up a sleepy newsroom, much less a complacent city, without making enemies. Atlanta's business community pressured the newspaper's management, and it ordered Bill to tone down his editorial policy. He looked management in the eye and said, "I quit." His resignation prompted what may be a first in the history of big city newspapers, a grassroots rally on Bill's behalf in downtown Atlanta. Atlanta's loss was clearly Harvard's gain. Bill came here to head the Nieman program, the world's oldest and most prestigious mid-career journalism program. While here, he co-founded and co-chaired the Committee of Concerned Journalists with Tom Rosenstiel. And the two of them, of course, have been going around the country holding forums, getting journalists to think about their craft and how to improve it. Rosenstiel says of Bill, through the strength of his character, Bill has become a mentor to more great journalists than any other editor in America. There's a not very well kept secret about Bill Covetch. He's been blessed with his own mentor, his wife Lynn. Their good friend Tom Winship says, "When we think of Bill Covetch at Harvard, we think of Bill and Lynn at Harvard. At every Nieman event, there she is, front and center. Lynn knows as much about the jungle of journalism as does her husband Bill. Bill is universally hailed as the conscience of American journalism, and that's no exaggeration. He is our ethical rudder. Whenever a serious editor wrestles with an ethical issue, it is almost standard procedure to check in with Covetch at Harvard. Bill and Lynn's departure will be a huge loss to the vitality of the Cambridge community." Finally, we wanted to get testimonials from some of the more than 200 Nieman Fellows who have been here during Bill and Lynn's tenure. But But each time we asked one of them, they responded as if they were sworn to a code of silence. It led us to wonder what the hell was going on over at the Lippman House. So we dispatched our own team of investigative reporters. They had to resort to a Watergate-type break-in. They said the house was actually kind of in shambles a little bit, but they came back with a worn 6-year-old videotape that we might well submit next year for a Goldsmith Investigative Reporting Award, and we'd like to share our find with you. Could you dim the lights, please?
In my studies, have interviewed a lot of Neiman's, but I have to say that the fellows who made up the class of '94 was one of the most interesting I've ever dealt with. As a group, they were frenetic. They challenged every type of leadership known to organized society.
Disco fever!
The only way to pacify this crowd was to distract them. And the easiest way to distract them was with parties, with alcohol. And with an elimination of all restraint on time and any kind of normal behavior.
Everything is falling apart, don't you see?
We're a convention of people without sex organs.
Body.
I want Harvard girl. One of my predecessors' sayings about the program was it's designed to get the Neiman's to scratch where they don't itch. And this year's class certainly did that.
I never ever believed this. It's just incredible.
I'm not sure the university will survive. I'm not sure that the party room at the Taubman building will ever be used again.
Bill Covetch, incomparable journalist, wonderful man, true friend to Harvard and to the Shorenstein Center. The podium is yours. Bill. You like that?
That was the most challenging class I had in my 10 years here. And one member of that class happens to live with our moderator this evening. Where is she? Here she is. It is, well, it's a difficult evening for me, but it's very, it's nice to be here with friends, and it's especially nice to be here 9 years after the Goldsmith awards were established. Marvin and Gary invited me to speak at the luncheon that inaugurated this prize, and I'll say now what I said then. The thing that is most impressive about it and most encouraging about it for journalism and what it means in a democratic society is that a citizen designed this award for journalists. A citizen decided there should be encouragement for the kind of journalism that a democratic society needs. And I think quality journalism will only survive so long as there is a citizenship that requires it. So the family is is to be honored for that, and I'm honored to be a recipient of an award from a group like that. Let me begin with what I think all journalists ought to have is full disclosure. The truth is that if my career deserves this award, it can't be mine alone. I'm surrounded on this platform by ghosts who have directed and shaped my career, often, maybe usually, against my stubborn resistance. And just so you'll have an idea who shares this award, let me just introduce a few of them to you. There's Lila Rose Denton, who ignited in me a love of words and convinced me that even I might be able to use them effectively. There's George Kelly, an editorial writer who made me understand that what the people don't know will hurt them. There's Tim Pridgeon, an old weekly newspaper editor who taught me his first line of his reporter's creed: tell the people what you know and don't try to bullshit them about what you don't know. And there's Nat Caldwell, who the first Nieman Fellow and Pulitzer Prize winning journalist I ever met, who drilled into me the journalist's obligation to those betrayed by people in power and pointed me to some of them who were trapped in the played-out coal fields of Appalachia and in the black ghettos of Shanklin Alley in the shadow of the Capitol building in Nashville, Tennessee. And there's Ralph McGill, whose work spoke to me of the values that govern journalism in the public interest. And finally, there's one person here in the flesh who shaped my career every step of the way, who I hope will stand up so you can see what a great sounding board editor and friend looks like, my wife, Lynn. What all of these people and a lot of others help me understand is the obligation each journalist assumes when choosing a life as public witness, which is what one does when one chooses to become a journalist. All of our lives are shaped and directed by a world we can neither touch nor see, a world which we only know as a virtual reality. The degree to which we can adequately and accurately see and feel this larger world, the degree to which we can measure and judge it, and depends on others. Like Stella in Streetcar Named Desire, we're all in the end dependent on strangers. Journalists are the strangers on whom we depend, and like Stella, we're all at the mercy of their integrity and their reliability. Journalism does more than just inform us. Journalism in the public interest engages us, and it allows us to moderate those forces which shape our lives. In the past few decades, this responsibility of the journalist in a free society has become both more vital and more difficult. The journalist today is engaged in a struggle to clarify and maintain the principles that assure the integrity and reliability that the public deserves. And it is this struggle that I would like to talk to you tonight. In 1979, when I became chief of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, we had no personal computers, no fax machines, no cellular telephones, and the internet was an instrument of the Cold War called ARPANET, used exclusively by the military, industrial, scientific community. All of that and more is now part of a revolution which, as an agent of change, has had few equals in its impact on social, political, and economic organization in the world. Consider the impact on politics, the spread of ideals such as human rights, freedom of expression, and the efficiency and benefits of one form of government over another was the solvent which dissolved an empire which it took the communist government of Russia 70 years to build. At a conference in Prague shortly after the Berlin Wall came down, a journalist from Poland said it was the images pouring into the country through satellite video and fax newspapers more than anything else which created a new public opinion behind the broad popular support for the solidarity movement that ended communist rule there. It was, he said, when we finally could see for ourselves that countries like Japan and Korea and even Singapore had moved so far ahead of us that we knew our system was a failure. Consider the impact on economics. With the movement of information at the speed of light has come a new economic order in which the currency traders and commodity markets exert more influence on a nation's economic policy than the national government. The nation state is eroding as advanced nations struggle to build regional and multinational alliances to moderate the disruption of these new buccaneers of the marketplace. And the impact on journalism has been at least as disorienting. The most obvious impact has resulted from two fundamental changes. First, the mixing of media by digital technology, which merges all forms of communication, word, picture, and print, on the World Wide Web, which has created itself new platforms to attract readers and advertisers. Second, the fragmentation of the means of production and the choices available means anyone, anywhere is a potential competitor to traditional news organizations. Anyone, anywhere is a potential customer. As a result, journalism appears in an atmosphere that erases the boundaries between advertising and editorial, in which it is difficult to distinguish journalism from commerce or to recognize the value of journalism from all the other information pumping through the system. Recent polls in the United States which show a public increasingly frustrated and alienated by the news media have made the point with depressing force. The media, they say, are part of the problem. The press, they say, more often hinder than help find solutions to our problems. The reason for this loss of confidence in the press as an institution is that the public can no longer distinguish between a journalist attempting to produce disinterested, balanced presentations from a self-serving political line or tabloid sleaze. We saw this emerge clearly during the first days of the coverage of the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, when the elite Washington press corps' competitive drive for a mass audience made it subservient to sources. Being first was more important than being right. The resulting reports shrill with hyperbole, speculation, prediction, gossip, and argument. During the first 9 days of that coverage, a content analysis done by the Committee of Concerned Journalists found that 41% of the assertions broadcast or published were not factual statements at all. They were instead speculation, prediction based on little more than suspicion or gossip. Further, the study found that 40% of all statements of fact were from a single anonymous source. This at a time when there were only two sources of information, Kenneth Starr's office or the White House, both of which had a special interest in how the story would be presented to the American people. This confusion is aided and abetted by the economic organization of the news industry in response to the developments of the new communications technology. The logic of the new marketplace is drawing journalism into a horizontal organization of communication conglomerates that exploits talent across media, making no distinction between the values which inform journalism and entertainment, journalism and commerce, and into a vertical reorganization which brings together corporations with vastly different cultures, goals, and values. Entrepreneurs from industries like General Electric, Disney, or AOL, to ingest entire news organizations which become merely divisions with a diminished role in the decisions of the company. These emerging mega corporations, which include journalism divisions, threaten to make the whole notion of a conflict of interest by journalists an antiquated idea. The theory of the free press, which emerged out of the Enlightenment, was that there would be an independent voice that could monitor and comment on the influence of those in power. We must all question today whether we can rely on a handful of behemoth corporations to monitor themselves or the other power centers with which they do business. Consider, for example, Michael Eisner, CEO of one such corporation, when he describes ABC television news by saying he thinks it inappropriate for Disney to cover Disney. In the mind of the CEO, ABC News is now Disney. In the mind of Michael Eisner, ABC News, by becoming part of Disney's commerce, has lost its independence. Will it eventually lose its purpose as well? And Robert McChesney, who couldn't be here tonight, a median historian in the book that he was honors for, says on balance, the system has minimal interest in journalism or public affairs, except for that which serves the business and upper middle classes and its privileges, sports, light entertainment, and action movies. Even at its best, the entire system is saturated by hyper-commercialism, a veritable commercial carpet bombing of every aspect of human life, close quotes. Witness the breathtaking speed with which the major television networks have dismantled the bureaus they established worldwide in the previous 30 years and have virtually gone out of the business of reporting world news and events. And this at a time of the greatest need for an independent world press. Here is how James D. Wolfenson, the president of the World Bank, sees the need after studying the results of a survey the bank did that involved interviews with over 20,000 people in underdeveloped countries around the world. And I quote, "What differentiates poor people from rich is a lack of voice, the inability to be represented, the inability to convey to the people in authority what it is they think, the inability to have a searchlight put on the conditions of inequality. A free press is absolutely vital to that objective. Freedom of the press is not a luxury, it is not an extra, it is absolutely at the core of equitable development. If there is no other spotlight on corruption and inequitable practices, you cannot build a public consensus to bring about change," close quotes. Inexorably, it seems, the power of profit offered by the new opportunities of commerce threaten the ability of journalists to maintain the independence necessary for their survival as reliable monitors of those who exercise political and economic power. In the most recent example, the acquisition of Time Warner CNN by AOL, Stephen Case didn't even mention journalism, the journalism represented by Time Incorporated and CNN, when he described the importance to the public of this newly merged corporation. What he mentioned was online shopping, entertainment, and person-to-person communication. That and the promise that in the first year, the newly merged companies would produce an extra $1 billion in pre-tax profits beyond the $10 billion that the two companies separate were expected to produce. How can he make this promise? As AOL's marketing director suggested in the New York Times, it would come from integrating editorial and advertising content. AOL, the Times reported, has long argued that the complete separation of editorial content and advertising is not applicable online. New media, they argue, call for integration of commerce and content. In other words, the editorial content is not to be determined by its importance to an audience as members of a self-governing society so much as it is for the commercial interest of the organization itself. But slowly, as the emerging economic organization of news companies marinates journalism in this mixture of entertainment, commerce, and promotion of self-interest, journalists are beginning to react. Nearly 3 years ago now, a group of 24 journalists met here at Harvard at the invitation of the Nieman Foundation to organize the Committee of Concerned Journalists. This organization has now engaged over 3,000 people, journalists and public alike, in public forums to examine, articulate, and promote standards of journalism and independence from self-interest communication and from commercial exploitation, an independence which would regain public trust and justify the continued protection provided by the First Amendment. In a statement of shared purpose the committee has circulated, here is what these journalists say defines their work. The central purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with accurate and reliable information they need to function in a free society. Over time, journalists have developed the following 9 core principles to fulfill that purpose. 1, an obligation to the truth. 2, a commitment to serve the public interest first. 3, to monitor the powerful and offer voice to the voiceless. 4, to provide a forum to the public for comment, criticism, and compromise. 5, to employ an ethical method of verification. 6, to maintain independence from faction. 7, to make news engaging and relevant. 8, to keep news comprehensive and proportional. And 9, to remain true to personal conscience. To the extent journalists themselves can articulate, practice, and defend these principles, and to the extent that the public supports these principles and considers them important, to that extent only can the concept of independent journalism in the public interest, a concept which has been evolving for nearly 300 years, safely migrate onto the new web of instantaneous, interactive, multimedia communications spinning out around the world. And we all have a stake in the outcome of this process. For whatever your feelings are about the press, it is, as Walter Lippmann said, at the core of the way a society comes to know and understand the world. It is, as John Dewey said, our means of continuing education for our entire population. It is a system which attempts to systematically make transparent to all of society the workings of the forces and the institutions and the people which wield power over our lives, to do so with reliability, and to note the activities of citizens and organizations which catalyze public affairs. And this is to say nothing of its role in monitoring the state of public life in all of its myriad forms, its hopes, its dreams, and its accomplishments. Such a press institution is a pervasive and central factor in every phase of our lives as individuals, in the shape and nature of our communities, in the character of our governments, and of ourselves as a people. The contribution of such a press in the interest of self-government needs and deserves more thoughtful care and attention from all of us, but it must begin with journalists themselves. That care and attention will not come from journalists whose highest aspiration is to be first with the most shocking or titillating scandal. It will not come from the marketplace, which values only quarterly earnings. It will not come from those who see the press only as a tool to manipulate public opinion for political or commercial advantage. That care and attention will come only from journalists who are deeply and passionately committed to an independent press in league with an enlightened public which values such a press. If and only if such journalists become active, aggressive, and vocal participants in the current struggle over the future independence of the press, can we hope to regain and retain the support of the public. Then and only then can we hope to realize the potential that the internet offers journalism and a democratic society, the potential for the beginning of a truly golden age of a free press in the public interest. Thank you.
Bill, thank you for one of the most powerful and thoughtful statements on journalism, I think, that's been expressed in this room. If you have questions, could you go to the microphones? And I'd like to ask you a first question, Bill, and it's a question of, with the Committee of Concerned Journalists, sort of whether there's been resistance within the profession to some of that work, or I'll let you take your choice of these questions, among those who sort of have embraced much of what you do, what have been the obstacles to getting the agenda moving forward?
It's been amazing the degree to which there's been excitement through the reporting ranks, somewhat through editing ranks around the country. As I say, there have been only over 3,000 people involved in these forums, and there are people that call Tom Rosenstiel or I almost every day wanting to sign on, wanting to know what they can do to help. So there's an excitement about what we're talking about. There is resistance among senior editors at many news organizations who don't believe they need anyone outside overseeing their work. I understand the concern about control and licensing, but what we're talking about is journalists themselves, not an outside force. A number of news organizations have already talked to us about coming in. One of the things we're doing, we're developing around these principles that journalists themselves have articulated. We've developed a keen understanding of the history of how each of these principles arose, how it came to be in the first place, and what commercial advantage it offered the owners of the press at each step of the way. It's not just theory and philosophy. It is a breathing, real way of doing business as well. And we're developing, with the help of Howard Gardner here at the Graduate School of Education and Bill Damon at Stanford University, a curriculum built around these principles that we hope to take into news organizations, and where I hope to get most of all is into boardrooms, to help the people who are making the decisions about news organizations in their companies, organizations about which they know virtually nothing. Help them understand why it's in their economic advantage, if nothing else, to preserve the integrity of a dependable news organization. So there's a lot of excitement, and the most exciting thing about it is the people in our surveys and the people I hear from most often are young kids who are on the internet, who want to know, what are the ethical standards? Nobody's talked to me about that. I mean, what responsibility does a journalist have? And the fact that our national survey, that cohort, the young people in the survey were more concerned about ethical standards than were older journalists. So it's pretty exciting. I feel pretty good about it.
I have two quick questions. First, in your list of principles for concerned journalists, there were two of them that sounded to me like they could be contradictory. And one of them you said to give voice to the voiceless, which earlier in your talk you had talked about the poor of the world as being the voiceless. And so I didn't know whether you were when using the term voiceless to mean the poor and powerless. But then there was another principle, which was to not identify with any faction, and it seemed to me that that would be a contradiction, because, you know, there are factions in society, classes, the rich versus the poor, and so you know, did I misunderstand that, or is there a conflict there?
No, I don't think you misunderstood it. I mean, I don't consider voiceless people a faction. I mean, how can they be a faction if they're not organized, if they have no voice? I mean, I understand if you're thinking in class distinctions, that if you identify with one class over another, but
I mean, to me, that
there are voiceless people in major corporations. there are people who have things to say that aren't represented in the basic news report of the day.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the most fundamental conflicts in every society is conflict between different classes. And in a democratic society, the poor have more power than they do in other types of society.
Right.
They're not totally powerless. They have the vote. They have politicians who cater to them. So it seems to me that when you say the voiceless, you mean the poor. That is a faction, and that if the press becomes identified with that faction, then you're contradicting the other principle.
No, but the whole concept of democracy is that someone has to hear that voice. I mean, politicians can manipulate people who have no voice. They can talk to them about what they need. But what journalism does is help the political leaders hear what they think they need. I mean, I guess you could call that a faction. I don't define it that way. I mean, I understand the point you're making, that the press takes a side in an issue. But I think when it's a matter of giving voice to people who are not heard, I think the press has to take a side. I think in the civil rights movement, for example, I think there were people who were not being heard. And without a press there to give them a voice, we never would have confronted that problem. I don't consider that a factional
I'm not sure I'm
conflict.
disagreeing with you or not. I mean, I like Ted Koppel. I like the Jim Lear news hour, because they always, to me, this is balanced reporting, because they always get both sides on. Now, there's a lot of other reporting where you...
Both sides is a waste of time.
Pardon?
Both sides is a waste of time. There are a lot more than two sides to any.
Well, at least two sides. And I see a lot of reporting that irks me, because I only see one side being presented.
I don't disagree with that.
Huh?
I don't disagree with that.
Okay, now my second question is easier, and I won't argue with you no matter what you say. But my second question...
Well, I know I'm right, but...
I heard... I heard you saying that talking about the forces that brought down the Soviet Empire, that the people would see that people in Singapore and South Korea were living better than they were, and I'm wondering, in view of that, what made Abe Rosenthal think you were a communist?
You'll have to ask Abe Rosenthal. I guess because I talked about giving voice to the voiceless.
Hi, my name is Felicity Spector. I'm a television journalist in Britain with ITN Channel 4 News. And I wanted to ask you about one of your other criteria for standards in journalism, which was making the news engaging and relevant. And I wanted to ask you about how well you think television news is struggling with trying to achieve that objective. Because to me it seems that many of them with the best intentions in the world are ending up, as we call it, dumbing down, or reducing their commentary to the lowest common denominator and justifying it by saying that this is making it more accessible, engaging, and so on. Can you say anything redeeming in television news, or is it still a lost cause?
Yeah, no, the one thing television does not have to worry about is making it engaging. I mean, the shortcoming there, as Marvin has said more times than I could, and in better ways than I could, the question there is making it relevant. I mean, you have to have both. That's why the two are joined at the hip in our principle, because everyone understands that you have to, in a competitive atmosphere and in an atmosphere where there are so many opportunities to pull out information on any subject, that you have to make it engaging. No matter how serious it is, you have to make it engaging. But you can't stop there. You have to make sure that what you're doing is making relevant information engaging, and not simply another story about Madonna or another story about whoever the latest cult figure is, or the latest hot property, or the latest interesting idea. it takes the thought that melds that engaging presentation to a relevant idea. If news magazines have in the print world have a similar problem because so much of their sales is based on street sales, on newsstands, and the cover is going to bring readers to the magazine. And they do a cover like they did with Katie Couric. That's engaging. Everybody knows Katie Couric, but it engages on an important issue, on an important subject, on colon cancer. That works. A cover a few weeks before or a few weeks ago on Madonna goes nowhere. I mean, it engages you, it takes you in to nothing of any value. It's entertaining, it's interesting, it's passes the time, but as a citizen, you've learned nothing of any value, and it does not motivate you to participate in society in any way other than as a passive observer of the cultural scene. So it takes both of those, and there's a lot of interesting television on, and the more channels we get, the more there is. The problem is you have to become the gatekeeper. You have to spend a lot of time surfing channels trying to find out where something worth watching is, and that's very, very inefficient way to get your news and your information, and that's part of the problem we're all dealing with. News is presented on 24-hour television in bits and pieces as it arises. That's a very inefficient way to get your news. It's not connected with anything, and you have to, with a pad and pencil, sort of connect what you heard or saw 5 minutes ago with what you're here 20 minutes later. You have to become the editor and the gatekeeper. None of us have time to do that. We have to, as journalists, figure out a way to cope with that world and to present a contextual updating of information with a brand name that says to you, come here and you'll get what you need. It's that, I mean, that's the trick. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Bill, I've known you for a while, but I don't think I've ever heard you talk directly about investigative journalism. And as there's investigative journalism and there's investigative journalism, and particularly on television, there's a lot of things that I see that are advertised as investigative journalism that I really have a problem with. I don't think that it really merits the term. I'd like you to put yourself back in that New York bureau, and you've got this bunch of malcontents as your reporters, and they're coming at you. Isikoff is coming to, he wasn't working for you, but he's coming at you, and he wants to investigate the sex life of the president. You've got other reporters that want to investigate problems with food that is dangerous to people's health. You've got people that want to do investigations inside the government. You've got this whole array of investigative ideas that are coming at you. What are the criteria that an editor and a reporter should use in deciding which ones are the ones we should most legitimately go after, keeping in mind public service?
You just answered the question. I mean, which of these ideas is really not available? The fact there might be some cocaine on your money is, I mean, that's what these news magazines do. The fact that, well, that's a different one. Your bed sheets might not have been changed in the motel before you checked in. Those stories are interesting, but they're not vital. The sex life of the president, you have to think about that, what the context was. I wouldn't turn away from it. I don't think the sex in itself is the greatest story, but a lot of other things about that story made it important. No, I think the judgment has to be on how valuable is this to the citizen? How much do they need to know this information? And if I don't give it to them, where are they going to get it? I mean, I had tougher reporters than Isikoff. I mean, I had Cy Hirsch, and Cy Hirsch would drive anybody crazy, trying to hold him down. But all you had to hold him down before long enough was to find out who it was he was talking to and how solid the information was, because it was always worth public exposure. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem with investigative reporting is, one, it takes a lot of time and energy, and a lot of news organizations aren't prepared to invest the kind of time and energy into it that it takes. I mean, what Bartlett and Steele do, I mean, they're sui generis. There are not many people. Gene Roberts supported it, Time Magazine supporting it. Not many people would do that, and yet they've paved the way to a whole new world of examination of the economic power in this country, which arguably has more influence over my life than the government does. But we're not examining it carefully, except for people like that. It's the commitment of time and resources that's the problem, and the decision by most editors, many editors, that, yeah, we'll do it, but we'll do it now. We'll do a big piece now on an important topic, and then we'll start working on another big piece that we'll do 3 months, 6 months from now. Boom. In between, what you expose that first time, it disappears. And you don't get any subject. You don't get any learning. You don't get any movement of 200 million people in a society by presenting information in big globs. You get it? Those thoughts and ideas grow the same way a stalagmite does, one drop at a time. So if you build into your news operation an investigative process that grows out of daily coverage of a subject, so that every day there's a piece of that story or a repetition of a piece of that story, so that public awareness of that trend or that subject grows, then you're doing great reporting. Otherwise, you're doing great pieces, but the impact on the public is lost. That's the basic thing I think needs to be analyzed. But investigative reporting is vital in a democratic society, because it's the only reporting that carries in it a moral question. Is this right or wrong? I mean, you're raising a question with your reader or your viewer every time you do an investigative piece. Pass judgment on this behavior. Do you, as a society, believe this is okay or not? And that's what it does.
Are there some investigative reports you think shouldn't be done?
Well, I don't know.
For example, I mean, and I'm not saying I think there are either, because I struggle with this, but things where you basically can tell you're filling up a newscast, usually this is on television, with things that focus people's attention on one area of public life, when that is really not at the center of a civic concern. And I know that tends to become a kind of political judgment, but you see it so often. Well, you wonder why we're spending all this effort.
A lot of the I-team things that go on local television stations that I for investigative is, I just think that's promotional material. I mean, some of it does good service, but it's overdone. It's hyped. It's created. I mean, the investment of time in those pieces, I think, could be better invested in much more important stories.
My name is Jody Silverman. I'm a student here in the mid-career program. And before coming to Harvard, I was in Washington, D.C. for 15 years on the other side of the press, working for members of the U.S. Senate and for some political advocacy organizations, trying to get them to cover our stories. And one of the biggest frustrations I had and still have, and it feeds into some of what you've been talking about, is feeling the need to distill very important issues into literally 10-second sound bites so that I could make sure the member got on the news, or to really catchy one-liners in press releases that I knew would grab the attention of a reporter or an editor before deadline. And I found that extremely frustrating, because these were critically important issues, very important issues, and very difficult issues to understand, and yet they were being really reduced to what I consider People magazine types of reporting, and then the next day they were on to the next story. And you've alluded to much of this, but how do we get beyond that?
It takes what did Hillary Clinton say? It takes a village. It takes all of us to do it. I mean, journalists have to resist the temptation to go short and sweet. Journalists have to push back. And part of what's happened in the last 20 years is, and one of the things that Hope will address with the committee, or the work of the committee, is that journalists have lived in this. The journalism I grew up in was a kind of magic world. We didn't have to worry about the people on the other side of that wall, that business side, and we did what we did, and we served a noble purpose, and we didn't have to worry about any of that. And so we didn't. We didn't think about it. We didn't think about the problems of the economics of a news organization. We didn't think about anything except our job. This world crumbles, collapses, and all these pressures come on journalists to behave differently. And they never exercised much of the brain power they were born with to learn about the economics, to learn about how issues move through the process. And so there's been a disorientation with all this new pressure, and they're suffering a loss of confidence. And journalists don't know who they are or what they are or why they are. And until they get hold of that and have the strength inside the newsroom to push back, to say, no, we're not going to behave that way. I'm sorry you're in a hurry. I'm sorry you think you have to have this tomorrow and I only have 150 words. I'm not going to do it. What happened out in Los Angeles, I don't know if you followed that, but there was a big hoorah about the collapse of the wall between advertising and the news, and the news organization became embarrassed by a commercial deal they struck with a major advertiser. And it was a very trying situation, but what has begun to turn it around and what may turn it into a positive experience were some reporters in the newsroom who said, no, we're not going to work in this kind of place. No, we're not going to do this. I'm proud to say 2 of them were reporters who had worked for me in Atlanta. And they said, no, we're not going to do this. And they went to Bill Boyarsky, the city editor, who said, you're right, we're not going to do this. And they pushed it back up the line till the publisher of the newspaper had to deal with those reporters who said, no, we're not going to do this. And that drew Otis Chandler out of retirement. And now the whole process is being re-examined. That could turn in. It's an embarrassment for everybody in newspaper journalism now, but it could turn into the beginning of a new sense of responsibility on the part of the journalists inside the news organization. And if that happens, if the public supports that kind of behavior in the newsroom, then something will happen. That's what's got to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations and well-deserved. Susan Moeller, I'm a Shorenstein Fellow. I've got a question picking up on the answer you gave to the last question, which was journalists aren't, the definition of journalism is not so clear anymore. And I wonder if you would just speak a little bit about the Committee of Concerned Journalists and how they're tackling the online journalism and the very gray areas of what is journalism. You talked in your talk about AOL's merging of editorial and advertising, but I think even more than that, just on the editorial side, just on the sort of content side itself, what is journalism and how some of the ethics that you're talking about bringing to the profession can affect the internet?
Well, the internet, to my mind, is only a delivery system. The content is going to be governed by the same basic rules, one way or the other. It's either going to be journalism or it's not. It's going to be something other than journalism. Journalism carries these 9 principles embedded in its development and presentation. Let me take the simplest one of all, truth. 1, commitment to the truth. This was the first principle to separate the earliest journalism from other forms of information. Before the periodicals arose in England in the mid-17th century, before that, the elite had the truth, more or less. They had their newsletters. Governments had diplomats that traveled and carried messages about what was going on in one country or another politically. The great trade and banking houses had newsletters. Their captains of their ships and their caravans carried messages about trade and commerce. They knew what was going on in the world of commerce. The people had nothing. The people had proclamations from the rulers. They had pronouncements from the pulpit. And they had troubadours who came through town and sang songs about what was happening 100 miles away. And they had gossip, and that was it. But these around the coffee houses, around the Enlightenment, around the conversations about science and technology and the books and everything, grew these little periodicals called The Scout and The Spy and all these wonderful names. But what they did in their presentation was to surround their information with a lot of detail. Names, dates, places, who said what to whom, to convince the people who were reading it, I can believe that, surrounded in facts. They had developed the first methodology for some approach to an objective truth. That was the very first principle, and it was designed as a commercial device to sell this thing to people. And it was out of these periodicals that the first, what we call now, public opinion grew. For the first time, the public knew enough about what was going on in their community to have an opinion about it. Enough of them had the information. So if we can get journalists to think about and understand that that's what they grew out of, and I can recite the same history to you for every one of these 9 principles. I mean, that's what we've been doing the last 2.5 years is going back in our research to find out where this notion started and why it started and how it came to be. We were in a terrible situation like this for much the same reason back after in the early parts of this century. The introduction of high-speed presses, telephones, all this stuff, urbanization, the great scourge of yellow journalism. Pulitzer and Hearst throwing trash everywhere, and Adolph Fox walks up to New York, buys a newspaper, and says all the news is fit to print. That was a commercial slogan. That was designed to sell that newspaper, to say you can buy this newspaper, put it on your kitchen table, your children can look at it, and you won't be embarrassed. But it was predicated on the notion that their information was going to be verified. It was not going to be gossip and scandal. It was going to be verified information, and created the most successful newspaper in this century. And it started as a commercial device, but a commercial device embedded in the principles of the kind of journalism I'm talking about. So I think that's what we have to get journalists more aware of.
Thank you.
Take one more question.
Congratulations.
Hey,
I wasn't going to ask anything, but when I heard you talk about the voice of the voiceless, I felt obliged to, and to work up the courage to get up and ask this question. As you know, I think as probably a fair number of people know, there's another award-winning journalist who's on death row right now in Pennsylvania, who was evidently known as the voice of the voiceless precisely for his radio journalism, for which he won the award in Philadelphia. And my question isn't so much about the details of the case of what took place in 1981 with Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Right.
But my question is really about the handling of the movement that's grown up around his case, the people who are calling for a new trial, and the treatment of that and that whole issue by the media in the light of some of your remarks tonight. In particular, be it National Public Radio, or one could cite the documentary by 2020, or the typical way of referring to him. I remember participating in a demonstration in Philadelphia, and the next day the headline was, there were several thousand people there. The next day the headline was 2,000 demonstrators support cop killer. That was the Philadelphia Inquirer. And it's awfully hard, I think, for people to read an article with the expectation that they're maybe going to learn anything, whatever the facts might turn out to be in the article, if the headline is labeling somebody a
I'm
cop.
surprised at that. Is that right? I'm amazed. I would be amazed.
It's not always the case, but it's a fairly standard referent.
Oh, I know. I've heard the reference a lot, but I would be amazed if the Inquirer had that headline.
I could verify it for you. But
yeah, I'd love to
in
see
general, do you think that, and then the New York Times, for example, had a front page feature in the News of the Week in Review, the return of radical chic, trying to sort of knock down the well-known figures who were rallying to
well,
this.
I think, I'm sorry NPR felt it couldn't carry some of his. I mean, I'm one way or the other about the case. I don't know. I have no idea. But I don't know why you would smother a voice unless it was so outrageous. I just don't know enough about that case except to say I'm disappointed that NPR. John, do you know anything about that, Dingus? Do you know anything about that? Yeah. Why NPR wouldn't run it? You decided not to? No, you decided not to? And you agreed, that's all I'm asking. I agreed. Okay.
I agreed that we shouldn't run 13 commentaries. It probably would have been appropriate to run one.
Yeah.
But to give him almost a weekly voice at a time when his case was on appeal, even though supposedly the commentaries were not going to be about his case, it seemed to me that would amount to giving him an incredible forum to plead his case and develop a movement. And so we decided not to run that, and it was then immediately said about us that we had touted out as the Philadelphia Police, rather benevolent associated, which of course is very upsetting.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I would respect his judgment and Bill Busenberg. I know them both, and I know how reluctant they would be not to give voice, and not knowing the details, I would defer to what John said. Basically, I'm for more and more information, but it has to be decided somehow about how much time and space you're going to give to any
Just
issue.
one.
Come on.
But there was a speech made by Bob Dole right around the time when that decision was made on the Senate floor. There were funding considerations that people claim were part of.
Okay, I was on the board of NPR for 6 years, and I can guarantee you, because I've argued with John and the rest of them a lot, but I can guarantee you they did not make fundamental decisions because they were afraid of Bob Dole or Newt Gingrich. They did have to worry about where their funding was coming from, but that would not happen. That just wouldn't happen that way.
Bill, thank you very much, Bill Covetch. You can't leave yet. Can't leave yet. We've violated the plan that was carefully laid out. Bill and I were to sort of sit side by side at these chairs while Bill responded to the questions, and then I was to say something about the chair that Bill was sitting in and whether he had any claim to it, and he does.
Bless your heart.
We have a Harvard chair for you, Bill.